Hello, everybody. Let's get started. We'll have a few people trickling in, but we can get the show on the road. Thank you, everyone, for coming to today's talk by Larry Siems, entitled "Redacted Lives: Secrecy and Mohamedou Ould Slahi's Guantanamo Diary." I'm Chris Cervanek, the Associate Director at the Center for Civil and Human Rights. And before we get started, I want to thank our co-organizers at the Hesper-Gusko Scholars Program. I see a lot of HYSP students in the room. Thank you for coming. Undergraduates are always welcome at our events, so it's a real treat to have you here. And I want to thank the team there at Hesper-Gusko, especially Professor Joe Buttigieg, who helped get this off the ground. I'm also particularly grateful to Notre Dame English professor John Mathias, who's in the room. He was Larry Siems' professor during Larry's undergraduate studies here, and he really is the one who connected us and made this all possible. So it's now my profound pleasure to introduce Larry Siems. He's one of our own. He studied English and classical Greek here at Notre Dame before going on to study an MFA in poetry at Columbia University. He's published scores of articles on human rights and cross-cultural themes, served for many years as the director of the Freedom to Write programs for the writers' advocacy organization PEN. His work has appeared in a wide range of publications. You've heard him on NPR. He's appeared, his work has been in the New York Times, the LA Times, LA Weekly, Slate, and the Southern Poetry Review. We're here today to learn about his work editing, introducing, and annotating the book Guantanamo Diary. It's an extraordinary publication. It was written by Mohamedou Ould Slahi, who's been imprisoned at Guantanamo since 2002. It's the first manuscript by a prisoner still detained in Guantanamo, published in 2015, January of 2015. And it's published or forthcoming in 20 other countries, and I imagine that number will grow. I just finished the book yesterday and suspect it's the most important book I'll read this year. This Mauritanian author has really written a masterpiece, and Larry's dedication to the project of bringing this work to light is clear throughout, from his excellent framing introduction of the book to footnotes throughout, attempting to guide the reader through the complicated, redacted sections of the text. We're grateful you've returned to your alma mater, Larry, to discuss the process of bringing this manuscript from classified secret to published book. Please join me in welcoming Larry Siems.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Is this good? Thank you so much, Chris. Joe from the English department and John, who Chris mentioned, was an amazing poet, an incredible teacher, and in a strange and wonderful way launched me on the journey that brings me before you today. It shouldn't be me who's here. We need to start with that and acknowledge that. It should be Mohamedou Ould Slahi who's here today, who is the one who wrote this amazing manuscript. Since he's not here, I thought I would spend this about an hour talking a little bit about my experience of working with this incredible manuscript and what that experience has taught me about censorship and about censorship as an operative tool of our country's human rights violations after the September 11th terrorist attacks. And just to keep in mind, throughout this talk, censorship, I believe, has a lot to do with why Mohamedou is still not able to talk to you today. So. This is the CD-ROM that I received in May of 2012. The Slahi manuscript unclassified edition. This is what was written. I'm sorry. This is Guantanamo detention camp. Keep your eyes on the sort of the middle. This is Camp Echo of Guantanamo Bay detention camp. It's an isolation area. That compound with two huts was Mohamedou's home from August 2003 until December of 2015. It was in that hut that he experienced one of the most terrifying and deliberate and cruel interrogations and tortures in Guantanamo. And it was in that hut in the summer of 2015 that he wrote this amazing manuscript that became Guantanamo Diary. It took 7 years for that manuscript to reach me, that CD-ROM to reach me, because of this. This is the protective order that governs every single thing that a Guantanamo detainee says, speaks, writes, sneezes in Guantanamo. The minute a Guantanamo prisoner speaks, the words that he's spoken are classified. And they remain classified unless the U.S. government decides that the public can hear them. This protective order governs their attorneys. And so the materials that it refers to are specifically materials that prisoners give to them. Mohamedou gave this manuscript to his attorneys in sections through the summer of 2005. Every time he would give them a section, they would have to turn it over to the U.S. government censors, who would put it in an envelope, and it would be sent to a facility outside of Washington, D.C., a secure facility that holds all the materials by Guantanamo prisoners. You can see this is just some of the language from it. This is the kinds of things that it covers. Documents and information include, but are not limited to, can I read the one in the back? All printed matter of any kind, formal or informal, including originals, conforming copies, and non-conforming copies. All classified information the government provides petitioner's counsel, and all classified information petitioner's counsel otherwise possesses or maintains shall be stored, maintained, and used only in that secure area. That's where that manuscript lived, in the secure area outside Washington, D.C. for 7 years. During that 7 years, Mohamedou's attorneys conducted secret litigation inside of Guantanamo to try to force the U.S. government to declassify it and clear it for public release. This is how it looks. It's a 466-page manuscript, handwritten in English, his fourth language. He's from Mauritania in West Africa, so he was bilingual in Arabic and French. He went to the university in Germany and lived in Germany for 12 years, so he was fluent in German. He probably had a German's passing knowledge, or more than passing knowledge of English, but by no means fluency. He acquired English almost entirely in U.S. custody. And then he wrote this manuscript in 2005. There's his writing, and then there's the hand of another editorial voice, which is the censors, the U.S. government censors. There are about 2,600 black bar redactions that were imposed on the manuscript when it was declassified and cleared for public release, ranging from short ones, as you can see, to multiple pages that we still cannot see. You see at the top, there are 2 levels of classification. First one, secret. No foreign means it's secret. Within the U.S., you have to have a secret security clearance, and no foreign means it is never to be shared with any foreign intelligence service, no matter what rank of clearance they have. And then the second one is protected, which is a second tier of declassification that it has to go through. So I got the manuscript in 2012. By this time, Mohamedou had pretty much given up on the idea of publishing it as a book. It sat there for 7 years. So I talked to his attorneys, and what we really thought about trying to do is see if we could get it excerpted in a major publication, just to get some sort of sample of this amazing material out there. So I took it to the New York Times, and took it to Times Magazine, and the Times Magazine kept it for 4 months. They made me turn over the whole manuscript to them. They submitted the manuscript to their lawyers. They read it, they debated it, they thought about it, and finally, after 4 months, they said, no, we're not going to do this. So I took it to Slate. And in 2014, in the spring of 2014, Slate did an excellent series of excerpts over the course of a week, which includes, this is a sample of those excerpts. But even that process was amazing because they forced me to stick very closely to the original. Any changes that I made, I had to justify for them because they were concerned that they would be accused of making a terrorist look good. So we went through that process, and then after that was published in Slate, there was a considerable interest from publishers, and an agent approached and said, I would like to see if we can package this, and Little Brown decided that they wanted to publish it in the US and Canongate in the UK. And so my assignment was now to edit this thing into a book. I got it right about that time. I got an email, just out of the blue, from somebody who claimed to be a hacker in Europe, and they said, we saw this stuff in Slate. I can help you see underneath those black bars. And I was like, oh, that would be awesome, right? That would be amazing. And I thought about it, and I did some digging, because I thought, that seems improbable, right? And I think it turned out that it couldn't happen because there are two levels of PDF files, and the U.S. government for a short time had made a mistake of releasing PDF files in which they had the original text and then imposed black bars on it so hackers could peel those bars off. This was after that mistake, so it wouldn't have worked. But in any case, I couldn't do it because that protective order left his attorneys so vulnerable that if I would have tried to see what was underneath those redactions, they could have been accused of leaking that information to me because, of course, they have seen the whole manuscript. So I had to go through an 18-month process of trying to piece together what's a kind of a fragmentary manuscript without the guide of what was underneath those redactions, without seeking classified information. And that was a process that I just want to talk a little bit about because it really was about learning to trust a man that I still to this day have never met. I had some help when I went to put this together. By 2012, the U.S. government itself had declassified about 140,000 pages that detail prisoner abuse in Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and Iraq after 9/11. And also in 2008, the two branches of the U.S. government published these two very, very significant reports. The one on the left is by the Senate Armed Services Committee, Inquiry into the Treatment of Detainees in U.S. Custody. And the one on the right is a Justice Department investigation that was prompted by the fact that so many FBI agents objected to the interrogation techniques that were happening in Guantanamo that they encouraged the Justice Department to investigate and so they could fence off their role and not be involved in these things. Both of these reports have extensive multi-page sections about what happened to Mohammed in Guantanamo. This is from the Senate Armed Services Committee report. This is a section that describes the interrogation plan for this special project's interrogation. Mohammed was one of two people in Guantanamo who were singled out for what they called a special projects interrogation, which, as we'll see, was clearly torture. This is the plan. Keep in mind that we wrote down the plan of what we were going to do to this man. And we wrote it down and we revised it over the course of about 7 months. Very quickly, you can read this, right? Yeah, so you see the first one, we're talking about, staging a kind of a fake kidnapping, putting him out into a boat, making him think we're going to take him to some far-off place. They'll actually drag him into a cell in Camp Echo. I showed you the picture of that cell, right? Those huts at the beginning. It's one of those two buildings. They're going to drag him into there. They've prepared the cell so he can't tell if it's day or night. And then he's going to be, that interrogation is continued. They'll shackle him to the floor, subject him to loud music, repeat it over several days, and so on. Torturers around the world have a really bizarre habit of keeping really good records of what they do. We've seen this time and time and time again in countries, Brazil, Guatemala, Argentina. After a regime falls that tortured people, you end up opening warehouses, East Germany, for example, where there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of meticulously detailed records of interrogations and tortures. And I've always thought, why? Why do that, right? I think this explanation is very simple. By doing that, you are committing to paper the fact that you're following somebody else's instructions, right? You're recording this for somebody else, and so you're protecting yourself. So we had the plans, and then we also had, although we still haven't seen them, we have the day-by-day records of his interrogators, called the Memoranda for the Records, which tells exactly what they did and what he said in those sessions. We haven't seen them, but the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Justice Department did. So in their report, you would get descriptions of that. And as I was reading the manuscript, I could line these two things up exactly. So you have here, for example, here Mohammed describes being dragged into a dark room. They dropped me on the dirty floor. The room was dark as ebony. Someone started playing a track very loudly, The song was "Let the Bodies Hit the Floor." I might never forget that song. There you have the Senate Armed Services Committee saying, the memoranda, and again, these are written by his interrogators, indicate that on several occasions from July 8th through July 17th, Slahi was interrogated by a masked interrogator called Mr. X. On July 8th, 2003, Slahi was interrogated by Mr. X and was exposed to variable lighting patterns and rock music to the tune of Drowning Pool's "Let the Bodies Hit the Floor." One of the most awful things that happened to Mohammed during this year, something that was so awful that the man who was assigned to prosecute him, a Marine lieutenant colonel named Stuart Couch, who was so enthusiastic to be involved in this because he was a Marine pilot and one of his friends was one of the pilots of the 9/11 planes. When Stu Couch found out that this had happened to Mohammed, he refused to prosecute him and resigned from the case. This is, here, we'll read Mohammed's version first. They handed me a letter he obviously forged. The letter was from DOD, that's the Defense Department, and it says basically, Ould Slahi is involved in Millennium Attack and had recruited 3 of the 9/11 hijackers. Since Slahi refused to cooperate, the U.S. government is going to arrest his mother and put her in a special facility. This is the Justice Department's version of that. On August 2nd, 2003, a different military interrogator posing as a Navy captain from the White House gave Slahi a fake memorandum from the Joint Staff U.S. Army Director for Intelligence indicating that because of Slahi's lack of cooperation, his mother would be apprehended for interrogation by U.S. and Mauritanian authorities, and that if she was uncooperative, she might be transferred to Gitmo. The letter referred to the administrative and logistical difficulties her presence would present in this previously all-male environment. Something that the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Justice Department concluded amounted to a veiled threat of rape. It is illegal. It is by definition, violation of the Convention Against Torture to threaten family members of a person who's in custody. So it was because of that this was clearly, by definition, an act of torture that the Mohammedu's prosecutor resigned. This is perhaps the strangest one. After the worst of his detention, when he's been sleep deprived and kept in isolation and darkness for weeks, he says, I started to hallucinate and hear voices as clear as crystal. I heard my family in a casual familial conversation where I couldn't take part. I heard Quran readings with a heavenly voice. I heard music from my country. Later on, the guards used those hallucinations and were talking with funny voices through the plumbing. This is the October 17th email from one of his interrogators to Lieutenant Diane Zierhofer, JTF Gitmo Behavioral Science Consultation Team member. They had a psychologist attached to these interrogation teams. Stated that Slahi told me he is hearing voices now. He is worried as he knows this is not normal. By the way, is this something that happens to people who have little external stimulus, such as daylight, human interaction, etc.? Seems a little creepy. Lieutenant Zierhofer responded, sensory deprivation can cause hallucinations, usually visual rather than auditory, but you never know. In the dark, you create things out of what little you have. So I'm going through the manuscript and I see this man is an incredibly accurate chronicler of his experience. I mean, on the first level, Guantanamo Diary is an extraordinary feat of memory. This is a man who has come out of one of the most extreme interrogations on record post 9/11, and he is able to record this thing in incredible detail, and in detail that matches almost exactly with the records of his own interrogators. Even for all that, I had trouble believing him sometimes. It wasn't that I believed that he was lying about what happened, but I began to discover layers and layers of prejudices and bigotries that I had just deep in my own head that come from, reading a manuscript from somebody who's writing in his fourth language, reading a manuscript by somebody who doesn't live in the United States, reading somebody who has a different religious framework than mine, and things like that. And so the next sort of stage as I started to live with this was that I kept discovering that he was always telling the truth, even when I thought he was wrong. And I'll just give you a couple examples of how that worked. Here's one of those things. Actually, I should back up a second. There's a whole section of the book that happens outside of Guantanamo, because before he gets to Guantanamo, we sent him to Jordan to be interrogated in a Jordanian prison, and then to Bagram, and then Guantanamo. Of course, we don't have the records of his interrogators in Jordan. So it's like, well, how do we know that this is true? But you would find little details like this from his time in Jordan. He says, around February 2003, the director of the Department for Fighting Against Terrorism in Jordan was subject of an assassination plot. He almost gave his soul back. Somebody planted a time bomb in the car's chassis of the biggest find of the Islamic movement in Jordan. The bomb was supposed to explode on the way between his home and his office. So and I'm like, there's something I can check, right? So I went and dug around for a little while. It took me about 10 minutes until I found this Al-Aram weekly, March 2002, last week's early morning car bomb explosion that killed 2 passersby in Amman Street was unlike any other terrorist attack the Jordanian capital has witnessed in recent years. The target of this blast was General Ali Bourjak, head of the Anti-Terrorism Unit, General Intelligence Department. He's in a Jordanian prison, and he still knows that this is going on, and he remembers it, and he reports it at exactly the right time frame. But then, as I say, there were times where I just thought he got stuff wrong. And here's one example. And he's forced after all of this, the objective of all of this is essentially, it turns out, and I think this is one of the most shocking parts of the story. Ultimately, the purpose of all of this was to get him to create testimonies and false confessions against a number of people. One of those people is a friend of his. He had lived briefly in Canada. One of them was a friend that he knew from Canada who has been picked up trying to immigrate into the U.S. and is in an immigration prison in Florida. And they just slide the guy's prison photograph from Florida in front of Mohamedou and said, tell me something about this guy, right? And Mohamedou, in sort of with his characteristic sarcasm, says, I outburst in laughter. I broke out in laughter as soon as I saw the expression on his face and the Bob Barker Calvin Klein orange uniform, the same that I was wearing, fashion of the day, I used to call it. So I was like, all right, Calvin Klein, I get that, right? Bob Barker, why? I don't know, you guys are probably way too young to even know what I think of when I think of Bob Barker, who was this very cheesy game show host who did this show, The Price is Right. And I was like, well, why did he go for Bob Barker? And I thought, oh, he just must have grabbed a cultural reference and got it wrong. I took the manuscript in to my editor when I'd finally sort of finished it, and we spent like a day going through it line by line by line. And he gets to this, and he said, what's this Bob Barker stuff? And I said, I don't know, I kind of phoned that one in. You know, I'll try to figure it out. And he turns around and he Googles Bob Barker. Bob Barker is America's leading supplier of prison uniforms. And they're the ones who provide the jumpsuits to Guantanamo. Mohamedou is just giving me a little bit of a very writerly detail about his prison uniforms. It turns out Bob Barker, which not only gives the prison uniforms, but is a supplier to everything. They supply all the needs of Guantanamo prisoners, and they brand everything. So they all walk around with Bob Barker soap, Bob Barker sandals, shower shoes, everything. So he knew well who Bob Barker was. There's another one. I think one of the most disturbing scenes in the book is that he is sexually assaulted by female interrogators, something that was fairly common in Guantanamo. And you think about that, this is something that we haven't talked enough about in the media and in general. These are professional women soldiers, right? That were put in a position where they were required to essentially do strip teases and lap dances for the prisoners because they had the crackpot idea that somehow this was especially traumatizing for Muslim men. This is during one of those scenes, and he says, in sort of an act of resistance, he says he sort of went on a mini hunger strike. He said, I refuse to eat. It makes sense, right? You're going to control your being any way you can. So he says, I'm not going to eat. And this woman's doing these things, and her supervisor bursts in and says, we're not scared. You're not going to die. We're going to feed you up to your ass. That's what they said. And I highlighted too, because I had a long, long fight with the editors at Slate over that word too. Because I said they don't really allow me to change very much. But I said, there's a funny part late in the manuscript where he talks about how hard prepositions are in English, And I said, okay, the two, take out the two, because I know the way guys talk in the locker room or whatever, right? They just came in and said, we're going to feed you up your ass. Never for a second did I think that that was a literal threat, right? Never for a second did it occur to me that somebody had actually said that with intent to do that. Until this last December. This is the Senate Intelligence Committee's report about interrogations in the CIA black sites. It's cables and records indicating that CIA detainees who are undergoing or had undergone the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques were subject to rectal rehydration without evidence of medical necessity, and that others were threatened with it. You get a sense of what that involved. Talked about using the largest tube we had. Mentions one guy named Majid Khan. Remember that name. Majid Khan, they called it a lunch tray. His lunch tray consisted of hummus, pasta with sauce, nuts, and raisins. It was pureed and rectally infused. Allegations that rectal exams were conducted with excessive force on two detainees. Once again, I just was unable to even imagine that Mohammed was simply describing his reality, right? It seemed unimaginable to me. One of the things about the censorship around Guantanamo is it's part of this process. I mean, think about what I just described, that process that I just described is so upsetting. You can only do that to somebody who you have utterly dehumanized, right? I mean, talk about torture as a vehicle for dehumanization, but it requires dehumanization to begin with to do something like that. My God, right? And we talk about how torture dehumanizes both the person who's tortured and the person who does it. And the most amazing thing about Mohammed's book, and this is, once I got past the fact that I had doubts about him as a storyteller, and I realized this man is 100% reliable as a storyteller, I was able to just learn from him and allow him to rehumanize this world of Guantanamo that we don't get to see because it's entirely censored and redacted and dehumanized, right? So just as an example, guards. Picture guards. What do you picture when you picture guards in Guantanamo? Something like this, right? These are the only images we've seen. We're not allowed to photograph their faces. Even in prison throughout, most of the time that Mohammed was there, they were required to tape over their name tags. Right? Who are these men and women? What are their lives like? What Mohammed does is he refuses to dehumanize us the way that we dehumanize him. And he spends the entire book looking at us, talking about us, talking with us, and differentiating us as human beings. This is a really funny introduction of a section that he called Guards, where he just described in detail a bunch of his guards. This is what one group, they keep rotating in new shifts of guards. This group. The guards wanted to be baptized with the names of characters in the show Star Wars. From now on, we are they redacted Jedi? They did, right? And that's what you call us. Your name is Pillow. Why do they call him Pillow? They called him Pillow because after months and months of deprivation, his interrogator finally comes to him and gives him a pillow. He says, "Oh, great, a pillow. Great, thank you very much." He says, "We have a joke in Mauritania of a guy who's he's naked in the street, and he's wearing shoes." He's standing naked in the street, and somebody says, "What can I get you?" And he says, "Bring me shoes." He said, "That's like giving me a pillow? Really? That's great." So all the guards called him Pillow, and they wanted to be called characters from Star Wars. He says, "I learned later on that the Jedi are sort of the good guys who fought against forces of evil. For the time being, I have forcibly represented the forces of evil, and the guards, the good guys." But he goes on from anywhere from like little brushstroke 2 or 3 sentence descriptions to multi-pages descriptions to introduce people that I know, I recognize from my life, right? Brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews. Little things. When he's in Bagram, he gets a funny guard who is trying to convert me to Christianity, he says. But they would debate about it. And he said, we were unanimous that the religious scriptures, including the Quran, must have come from the same source. And then he says, he gave me more time on the bathroom, and he even looked away when I used the barrel. They just had a barrel for their bathroom. But just that moment of connection and gentleness. There's a second guard in Bagram when he's being led out to go to Guantanamo, and they're shackled. They stop at the bathroom, and the guard says to him, "Do you like music? What kind of music do you like?" He said that conversation paid off in the form that he took my blindfold off so that I could take care of my business. There's an amazing scene. One of the things that happens to him during his year-long interrogation is that they refuse to allow him to pray. And he says to one of his guards, why? When they finally ease up on him and he becomes more friendly with his guards, why? Why would you do that? Why would you enforce an order that you know is illegal? That's prohibited by the Geneva Conventions. And the guard says, I know. My boss would have given me a shitty job if I didn't do it, so I did it. He said, I know I could go to hell for what I did to you, the guard tells him. Little moments. I was thinking about that and I thought, just on a personal level, what a way we should live our lives in a way that we imagine that any encounter that we have with that person could end up as 3 or 4 sentences in that person's book, right? And how do we want to be depicted? Do we want to be those guards, or do we want to be like this guard who was on a plane when he's on the way to Guantanamo and they're strapped down on these benches, shackled, strapped down, and he can't breathe. And he's yelling, guards, please help me, mister, please, my belt. He said a guard responded, but not only didn't he help me, he tightened the belt even more around my abdomen. He just learned a lot about human nature, right, in those little tiny scenes. One of his guards, after the excerpts ran in Slate, I got a phone call one day, and he said, you know those guys at the end of the book, those guards who give him a book? There's a group of guards who give him a copy of Steve Martin's The Pleasure of My Company, and they dedicate it to him when they're leaving. And he said, I'm one of those guys. I'm the guy who bought him that book. And I've gone on to see him 3 or 4 times. He lives in Portland. We're quite close. And he read the book and he said, I'm just hearing this guy talking. These are the conversations that we had. This is exactly this man's voice. So it wasn't just that I learned more and more about us as Americans by his depictions of us, but I learned more and more about one of the most important characters in the published version of Muhammad's book, which is the censors, who are also Americans. And I began to see them not as some kind of bureaucratic machinery, but also as individual people, and with emotional lives. This is one of the craziest redactions in the book at the top. This is when he's finally led outside by a group of Puerto Rican guards. And one of the Puerto Rican guards puts his arm on his shoulder and says, in kind of broken English, don't worry, you're going to get home. You're going to get back to your family. When he said so, I couldn't help breaking in, redacted. Lately, I've become so vulnerable. What's wrong with me? Just a soothing word in this ocean of agony is enough to make me cry, he says, right? What word did they redact? Tears. Why? Why? How could that be a classified word, right? And I thought about it, and all I could imagine was that whoever that man or woman is whose job it was to go through that page of the manuscript was sitting there, and the basic framework of that job is not to let out any information that humanizes people, right? That's essentially what you're doing. And so just got to that word, and he or she was so upset they just went, and that was, trying to even block it from themselves. The second one is a description of that moment in the interrogation that I described during the threat about rectal rehydration. This is the actual interrogation with the woman. It says, I am And that's why my government has designated me to this job. I've always been successful. Having sex with someone is not considered torture. Was leading the monologue. Every now and then entered the room and tried to make me speak. You cannot defeat us. We have so many people. We keep humiliating you with American. I have a friend I'm going to bring tomorrow to help me at least cooperate, said Riley. Didn't undress me, but touching my private parts with body. Throughout the entire manuscript, the U.S. government has deleted the word she and her. And they leave he and him, which is kind of stupid, right? Because you know when it's a pronoun and it's not he, and it's redacted, you know it's a woman. Not only that, but in this case, she takes off her uniform top and she's got a bra on and everything. So it's pretty obvious what's going on here. Why? Why were, and I just think there's, the censorship is a reflection of the consciousness of the shame of asking professional soldiers to do these things. So a lot of the censorship that's going on is us hiding truths from ourselves. And I just think I'll spend a few minutes talking about how that process is starting to shift a little bit, how my working with his manuscript has taught me a new way of looking at a much larger documentary record we have, in which I think individual lives are starting to emerge. Again, the censorship, if you think about it, is really meant to obscure people. I should say, actually, one of the amazing things was it took me about 6 months to do an edit of the manuscript. The manuscript's about 122,000 words. It took, I shaped it, I brought it down to about 100,000 words because it's in some places quite looping. It exhibits what they call traumatic storytelling. The closer he gets to the special project's interrogation. At the beginning, it's quite linear. But as he gets to the really violent part of his interrogation, he tends to do things where rather than just tell a story, he'll do like you saw the guards, right? He'll have a heading called guards, and he'll profile a bunch of guards, and he'll describe scenes involving those guards. And then he'll do the same thing under the heading of interrogators. And you'll realize after a while that these are overlapping periods, right? These are different ways of going at that same, essentially, brutally traumatic moment. So there was a bit of sort of consolidating those things, bringing them together. That took about 6 months. And it took me another year to finish the manuscript. And during that next year, I spent the entire time undoing the mistakes that I had made in that first 6 months. And this is just an example of what a page looked like, where what's in type is what I had edited it into, and everything that's in ink is taking out my mistakes and returning it to its original form. Once I'd learned not only that he was an accurate storyteller, but also that he was a brilliant narrative writer, that he had a strategy to some of the ways that he looped in and out of things, that his phrasings, which were sometimes obviously the phrasings of a non-native English speaker, had an elegance and a power that was best left untouched. And I remembered, the more I read it, the more I remembered when I was here at Notre Dame, I became a classical Greek major because I wanted to read the Iliad in Greek. That was the only reason. Still my favorite poem, my favorite work of literature. I think everything you need to know about war and violence is in that book. And Homer wrote the Iliad. You read it first semester of Greek. You read it first semester of Greek because it's quite simple. In vocabulary, it's got a very, very limited vocabulary. And so you just sit down and you learn it by reading the Iliad. The vocabulary that Muhammad uses for Guantanamo Diary is almost exactly the same size. It's about 7,000 words. Is his palette in which he creates these incredible effects. So one of the things is that there were times where he would leave out words or something, and I'd fill in the word, and then I realized that's not a word that he would use, right? So I went and I printed out. I just got a computer program that printed out his whole lexicon, and then I would confine myself only to words that he used when I was editing. So that process took about a year as I brought it closer and closer, I hope, to how he would have edited it with me if we had been together. There are still big chunks of it that we don't see. But I've learned so much about seeing what they're trying what they're trying to make it so we can't see. And so if there's anything that I hope you guys will take away from this, is that it's our job to figure out what our government doesn't want us to know. It's our job to do that. And here's a couple tricks on how to do that. The first one is love footnotes. Learn to love footnotes. Because the one place that redactors get sloppy is in footnotes. And in footnotes, footnotes is always the place where you get the first glimpse of incredibly important information. This is from the Senate Armed Services Committee report, description of Mohamedou's interrogation, describing the preparations of the Camp Echo cell, what they're doing to black it out and everything. There's the footnote, memo from, Lieutenant Richard Zuley. We also know from court papers that Richard Zuley was the interrogation team chief. He was the man who pretended to be Captain Collins and handed him the letter threatening his mother. Richard Zuley is a retired Chicago police detective. He lives 90 miles up the road. He was in the CPD before he went to Guantanamo. From Guantanamo, he went to Abu Ghraib. He's back in Chicago. He was almost court-martialed for this, but he lawyered up, as the documents say, which means I'm sure that he said, yeah, well, if you're going to bring me into court, you'll be interested to know that Donald Rumsfeld signed Slahi's interrogation orders, and so they backed off. But you have to think about these as individual peoples who are walking around this earth who have done these things, right? Individual lives that we're talking about, not just the prisoners, but also the torturers. Here's an amazing example. This is one of the great documents of the last 15 years, one of the most heroic documents of the last 15 years. This is a report by the CIA's Inspector General that he wrote in 2004. The Inspector General is kind of the interior investigation office. He has a fair amount of autonomy because he reports directly to Congress, but he's like the ombudsman in the CIA. He's supposed to investigate allegations of wrongdoing within the agency. By 2002, so many women and men from the CIA were like staggering back to Langley from the black site saying, you would not believe the shit we're doing there, you know? And so he launched an investigation, and this is the report that came out. The report has this thing. OIG opened separate investigations into 2 incidents. We still don't know what that first one is. And the second one, the death of a detainee at a military base in northeast Afghanistan. This is a Washington Post piece, this, March 3rd, 2005, from the great Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Dana Priest. Dana, she is one of the great exposers of the CIA black site program. This was 2005, she wrote. In November 2002, a newly minted CIA case officer in charge of a secret prison just north of Kabul allegedly ordered guards to strip naked an uncooperative young Afghan detainee, chain him to the concrete floor, and leave him there overnight without blankets, according to 4 U.S. government officials aware of the case. The Afghan guards, paid by the CIA and working under CIA supervision in an abandoned warehouse codenamed the Salt Pit, dragged their captive around on the concrete floor, bruising and scraping his skin before putting him in his cell, 2 of the officials said. As night fell, so predictably did the temperature. By morning, the Afghan man had frozen to death. After a quick autopsy by a CIA medic, hypothermia was listed as the cause of death. The guards buried the Afghan, who was in his early 20s, in an unmarked, unacknowledged grave. Unmarked, unacknowledged cemetery used by Afghan forces, officials said. The captive's family has never been notified. His remains have never been returned for burial. He's on no one's registry of captives, not even as a ghost detainee. The term the CIA uses for captives held in military prisons but not registered on the books. He just disappeared from the face of the earth, said one U.S. government official with knowledge of the case. The CIA officer, meanwhile, has been promoted, 2 of the officials said, who, like others interviewed for this article, spoke on condition of anonymity because they are not authorized to talk of this matter. It's the ultimate act of censorship, right? This guy is erased. Like, erased. We don't know his name, nothing. Until 2009, this is an amazing document. For those of you who are in the law school here, you'll know that one of the most disturbing parts of the post-9/11 torture interrogation program was the involvement of Bush administration lawyers in developing legal justifications for the use of enhanced interrogations. Those came out of what's called the Office of Legal Counsel in the White House. In 2009, the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility did an investigation of the Office of Legal Counsel, sort of an ethics investigation to say, how could lawyers have gotten it so wrong? Right? There were two people who wrote those memos. One was a guy named John Yoo, who's on the faculty of Bolt Hall in Berkeley now, and the other guy is Jay Bybee. Jay Bybee is a sitting federal judge to this day. This is from Jay Bybee's response to the draft report that the Office of Professional Responsibility had written criticizing him for his behavior. And they talk about a declination memorandum. That's a memorandum from the Justice Department saying we're not going to prosecute somebody, right? This is a declination memorandum that they had written about the CIA guy who killed this unknown person in Afghanistan. But look, in the footnote, oops, we find out who he is, right? A man named Gul Rahman. Not only that, we find out the name of the CIA person, and named Zerbil, right? Suddenly, just by a mistake, now they're actual human beings, right? That's Gul Rahman. Just worth giving a man a face. That's Matthew Zerbil's house in Virginia. We don't have a picture of him. We know where he lives. When we're talking about these things, again, we're talking about stories that involve real human beings, individual choices, individual actions, individual consequences and burdens. This is, again, I mentioned the Senate Intelligence Report that came out in December of 2014. The result of a huge investigation about the CIA's torture program. The publication of it was remarkable because the CIA spent almost 2 years trying to stop them from publishing what was a 5,000-page report that had come from going through all the CIA's interrogation records, looking into the question of whether or not torture worked. The CIA succeeded in getting it so that the Senate Intelligence Committee, the body of the U.S. Congress that is by law authorized to oversee the operations of the CIA. This is not like you or me, right? These are their bosses who had done this report. And yet the CIA has still managed to this day to suppress 4,200 out of the 5,000 pages of that document. The only thing we have is the executive summary of that document. That's been released. Must reading. It's incredible. In that report has this astonishing fact. While the CIA acknowledged to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in February 2006 that it had wrongly detained 5 individuals through the course of its detention program, I want to pause for a second on that. We're not talking about Guantanamo here. We're not talking about Abu Ghraib. We're not talking about forward operating base prisons where you round people up and you may make mistakes. These are the CIA's secret prisons. The only way you can get there is by a charter rendition flight taking you there, and then you're held someplace. It takes a little bit of planning to move somebody to one of these places, right? So we knew in 2006, according to what the CIA had told the House committee, that they'd made, what did they say? 5 mistakes, right? No, it turns out when the Senate Intelligence Committee went through their records, they found at least 21 additional individuals, or a total of 26 out of 119, 22% of CIA detainees identified in the study did not meet the standard for detention. This is a conservative calculation and includes only CIA detainees with whom the CIA itself determined did not meet the standard for detention. Okay, that's 21 people who did not exist in the public record between 2006 and 2014. Those are live human beings. Who are they? Go to the footnotes. This is one of the greatest footnotes I have ever seen. It's unbelievable footnote. Who are these people? Names, right? They include Abu Hudayfa, who was subjected to ice water baths and 66 hours of standing sleep deprivation before being released because the CIA discovered he was likely not the person he was believed to be. There's a man walking around on this earth by that name who had that experience, right? Muhammad Khan, who, like Zarmain, was among detainees about whom the CIA acknowledged knowing, quote, very little. Didn't stop them from putting him on a plane and sending him to a secret prison. Shaista Habibullah Khan, who, like his brother Saeed Habib, was the subject of fabrications by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was, as we know, waterboarded 183 times and gave a lot of false information. Haji Galji, who was detained as useful leverage against a family member. Let's pause and think about that for a moment. Nazir Ali, an intellectually challenged individual whose taped crying was used as leverage against a family member. Not so good. Juma Gul, who was released with a payment of something and some other currency. Ayatollah Haqqani, whom the CIA determined may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Oops, my bad. Two individuals, Muhammad al-Shamaila and Salah Nasir Salim Ali, on whom derogatory information was speculative. And Bismillah, who was mistakenly arrested and later released with and told not to speak about his experience. Every single one of those people is a Guantanamo diary, right? Every single one of those people has a story like Muhammad's. We didn't even know they existed, and we didn't know their names until a year ago. These are things that happened to them 12 years ago. That report is amazing because it not only shows what we did to other people, but it gives us a hint of what we did to ourselves. This is describing the extreme, what do they call it? Applications of the waterboard, as they like to say. In the waterboarding of Abu Zubaydah, the first person that we waterboarded him 83 times. These are from the CIA's own cables that were coming back and forth from. It happened in a secret prison in Thailand. And this is what their cables are sending home. First one, August 5, 2002. I want to caution the medical officer that this is almost certainly not a place he's ever been before in his medical career. It is visually and psychologically very uncomfortable. The medical officer that we have monitoring the waterboarding. August 8th, 2002. Today's first session had a profound effect on all staff members present. It seems the collective opinion that we should not go much further. Everyone seems strong for now, but if the group has to continue, we cannot guarantee how much longer. We're not talking about the prisoner here. We're talking about the CIA agents who are waterboarding. How much more of this can they take? August 8th, 2002, several of the team profoundly affected, some to the point of tears and choking up. August 9, 2002, perhaps 3 personnel likely to elect transfer away from the detention site if the decision is made to continue with the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques. August 11th, 2002, this is somebody who just goes back and looks at the videotape that they shot yesterday, right? He says, viewing the pressures on Abu Zubaydah on video has produced strong feelings of futility and legality of escalating or even maintaining the pressure. Per viewing the tapes, if you're going to watch these things, prepare yourself for something like you've never seen. Right? Those men and women are all walking around and living their lives right now too. This is what perhaps the most amazing little snapshot of a life. It talks about a man who is the CIA's chief of interrogations. Again, they block off his name. We don't know who he is, obscuring the humanity on both sides. What we know is that as chief of interrogations, this was one of the guys who was inventing this stuff. He was there, and it mentions a guy named al-Nashri. That's Abd al-Rahim al-Nashri, who was the alleged coal bomber. He was one of the 3 people that we waterboarded many, many times, is now on trial before a military commission in Guantanamo. After receiving the proposed interrogation plan for al-Nashri on January 1, 2003, Blank, the CIA's chief of interrogations, whose presence had previously prompted al-Nashri to tremble in fear, emailed CIA colleagues to notify them that he had informed the front office of the Counterterrorism Center that he would no longer be associated in any way with the interrogation program due to serious reservations he had about the current state of affairs and would instead be retiring shortly. In the same email he wrote, "This is a train wreck waiting to happen, and I intend to get the hell off the train before it happens." He drafted a cable for CIA headquarters to send to Detention Site Blue, raising a number of concerns that he, the chief of interrogations, believed should be entered for the record. I have some brilliant colleagues in the field of journalism. And this is one example of how brilliant. That officer has been identified by former colleagues as Charlie Wise. He retired not long after that message in the summer of 2003. We find out here, he's the one who authorized the lunch plate for Majid Khan, right? So not a particularly nice guy, or we think. Okay. He died of a heart attack within a year after he retired from the CIA. And you think about the lives, the individual impact that these have had on both the prisoners and the interrogators, and the fact that these men and women on both sides of that equation have carried these things in secret, out of our view and out of our sense of shared responsibility. Mohamedou opens the window on this world for us in the most graceful, and I mean graceful in a theological sense, way. A good example of his approach. He says, I don't know. I'm not going to judge anybody. I'm leaving this part to Allah. I'm just providing the facts as I have seen and experienced them. I don't leave anything out to make somebody look good or bad. I understand that nobody is perfect, and everybody does good and bad things. The only question is, how much of each? And I think when we move forward in this program as these lives surface, we have to look at them as human lives in a very complicated moment, but look at them in the context of their stories, their narratives, their pain, their experiences, and go through that storytelling process with that kind of generosity on both sides. That's Mohamedou. Beautiful smile. Real lives, real people. This is Mohamedou's home in Nouakchott, Mauritania. This is where on November 20th, 2001, the police showed up, and he'd been questioned many times already by security police and by the FBI. They said, we need to ask you a couple more questions. Drive your car to the police station to be home tomorrow. He got in the car, drove to the police station. He's never been home since. That's his mother on the top with his nephew Jamal, and his aunt on the bottom with his brother Yadi, who lives in Germany. His mother passed away 2 years ago. They were particularly close, which is why they did the ruse of pretending to kidnap her and bring her to Guantanamo. This is Mohamedou's 2,000-mile journey at the behest of the United States. It began actually when he returned from Canada in the year 2000, through Brussels, through Senegal to Nouakchott, where he was living, as I said, for a year before 9/11, and then November 20th, he's renditioned via Cyprus to Jordan. From Jordan, we took him to Bagram. From Bagram to Guantanamo. That's the part that he has to complete. A couple more pictures. He has a hearing, the good news, and I'll end on a happy note. He has a hearing, finally, at long last, before the Periodic Review Board in Guantanamo, which is kind of a parole board. And they've been clearing people for release, cleared for transfer, and then they go through another process of transfer. He has a hearing on June 7th. His attorneys believe, and I believe with them, I'm sure that he'll be cleared because every single body that's looked into his case has cleared him. But he'll be cleared for transfer, and his attorneys believe he might be home, might make that final leg by September. In that case, I hope he can come back next year and talk to himself. I'll take questions for about 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Yes. Yes. So he did, and he's been quite open about the fact that he joined Al-Qaeda. But he joined Al-Qaeda in 1991. He was a student in Germany. He comes from quite a modest, poor background in Mauritania. He's the 8th of 12 children of a camel trader. He incredibly gifted student. He won a scholarship to study engineering in Germany. And so in 1989, he got on a plane, the first person in his family ever to get on a plane, the first person ever to go to college, went to Germany, and this was during the final days of the Afghan civil war, and many, many young Muslim men in Europe, North Africa, other places, sort of on their summer vacation, went and trained with Al-Qaeda in camps to be part of the resistance against the communist-backed government in Afghanistan. It was perfectly legal to do that then. The European countries knew that they would get their visas checked when they came back. They would say Afghanistan. He trained in an Al-Qaeda camp. The munitions, he was trained on mortar shells. The mortar shells he describes in one of his hearings in Guantanamo were all stamped, the boxes were all stamped, made in the USA. Al-Qaeda was essentially, part of, we were funding the Mujahideen resistance to the communist government at that point. So that was the Al-Qaeda that he joined. He did it. He was there for 2 months for training. He went back to study the next year. The following summer, in the final days of that civil war, he went back. He was there, joined a unit for one of the last battles. I don't think he even saw any action. He was there for about a month. Kabul fell, and then all of the various warlord and Mujahideen factions started shooting at each other to see who was going to, eventually the Taliban emerged as the government of Afghanistan. But he said, this was not what I signed up for. I was only there to resist the communist oppression of Muslims in Afghanistan. And so he just said, I'm out, and went back to Germany. He lived in Germany then for the next 10 years. He married a woman from home. She came to Germany. They worked. He was a telecom engineer. He's like a computer repairman, telecom engineer. She was a housekeeper. He had some connection with some of the guys that he went to Afghanistan with. He maintained some kind of loose affiliations. A couple of those guys ended up being implicated as, Al-Qaeda turned its attention to the United States. But not everything indicates that he had nothing to do with what they were doing. He has a second cousin, a guy named Abu Hafs al-Mauritani, who was a Mauritanian poet of considerable talent, actually, who also went to Afghanistan around the same time and stayed there. He's a poet and a religious cleric, and he became part of bin Laden's inner circle, what they call his Shura Council. Abu Hafs stayed there, so one of the things that we had our sights on Mohamedou, partly because there had been an intercepted phone call between Abu Hafs and Mohamedou sometime in the mid-1990s. So he was, everybody, all this stuff was getting mapped all the time. At one point, Abu Hafs had a $25 million reward on his head. He was one of the deck of cards, if you remember that cute little thing that we had. But we knew from the 9/11 Commission report that Abu Hafs was actually a dissenter in Al-Qaeda. This is kind of crazy, but apparently Al-Qaeda had like a board meeting to decide whether they were going to do the 9/11 attacks. And Abu Hafs said, you can't do that. It's against Islam. The Quran forbids attacking civilians. Submitted a letter arguing that, and then left Al-Qaeda, fled with a group of sort of dissident Al-Qaeda faction to Iran. He was there for about 10 years. And then about 4 years ago, Iran sent him back to Mauritania. The Mauritanians held him for about 4 months while delegations from Europe and the US went and visited him in prison just to make sure that he was really, straight about not supporting those things. And then he sort of formally renounced Al-Qaeda. He's now a free man in Mauritania, has been for 2 years, Abu Hafs, while his cousin is still in Guantanamo. So those are the things that brought him into the radar.
I think this might be the most. Having this far as self-care. Rules of Redacted Lives.
That's an amazing question. I had been doing human rights work for about 17 years for the organization PEN, which is a writers' organization. Specifically deals with censorship and free expression and the imprisonment of writers in countries around the world for what they write. We do advocacy trying to get writers out of prison who don't belong in prison. In all of those years, I felt unscathed, right? I actually kind of thought I might be borderline sociopathic in a way, because I would do this, I would deal with these stories all the time, and then I would go home at night and I'd pop a beer and turn on the baseball game, and it was all good. It was all good. But, I have to say one of the things about human rights work is it looks thematically grim. It's the most amazingly inspirational work in the world because the people that you're dealing with, talking to, hearing about their families, they are so incredibly courageous, right? They're so incredibly optimistic. They're so incredibly vibrant and creative, right? And so you're sustained by that, right? You're not dragged down by it. It's like the energy of dissenters, is something that is so deeply admirable and so energizing. And I've been so grateful to have been able to have that energy in my life all these years. But it's interesting because about a year into the process of editing this book, out of nowhere, I went through about a week and a half of the most grotesque and violent nightmares I've ever had in my life. I mean, just hit night after night, and every night I would wake up and I would just it was me doing unspeakably bloody things to people, and I was like, what, am I having a breakdown? What's going on? Where is this coming from? I haven't even punched anybody in my entire life, right? I'm the least violent person. And it went on, and I was getting more and more disturbed, and I was like, why, what? And then one day I just sat down and I looked at this manuscript and I said, oh, yeah, okay. And I once I recognized that somehow it was just finally the accumulated weight of, because I think what happened in the process of the manuscript is I really, really emotionally occupied that world because Mohamedou is such a brilliant storyteller, and I moved deeper and deeper and deeper into that emotional experience in a way that I never had in my professional life. So it took about a week and a half. I think I had 2 beers when I watched a game, 3 beers. I don't know. You do that thing. I mean, you do that kind of self-medicating thing. I mean, and you try to distract yourself. But then it wasn't long before the other side kicked in again, where Mohamedou's endurance, his humanity, his faith, sort of enveloped me again, and then I was just onward. I mean, if he can maintain, this graceful faith in all of us, and he's right. We're all a mix of good and evil. Once you start to sort it out that way, and you see this is a deeply, deeply human story. There is no more intimate human story than torture, right? There's no more intimate human exchange than torture, and so you're looking at us in all of our darkness, but often in all of our light. So, it was both the illness and the cure were in the same package, I think.
Question has to do with the fact that for the redaction, something fundamental has happened in the way politics of possibility to oversee our so-called redaction. So what I'm thinking here about is that the recent photographs from I mean, there's so much that's not really within the league, but in fact, there's far more never been disclosed at all. I expect at some point we would have to have it disclosed. And yet the argument continues to be persuasive at some level, regardless of who's president, regardless of who, in fact, is in the Senate Central Relations Committee. It seems as though everyone is more than willing to hold back on this because they think that by the Central Intelligence Agency or anyone else, that whatever kind of investigation we did earlier that revealed that we were on the job trying to provide oversight and we're upset by what was going on, we still in the end will do nothing about it. And as I'm an academic, I find deeply, and also a graduate of Berkeley, I find deeply appalling, that John Yee still has a job and actually, I can't believe he's even functions as a human being. He's like the biggest morons I've ever seen. And I met him in Crawford, and he's actually, it's like a stone. It's like deep, it's stiffer than a stone. So, but it's just amazing to think that people are, as you're trying to suggest, become scot-free of all this. But more importantly, when do we actually come to a point in which we can do anything about redactions? I think obviously we know that most of our the Guardian will say we're only getting 280 pictures, but there are 500 more we can get.
Right.
The Guardian does more work on this than the New York Times does.
Right. I mean, look, no, it's amazing. I mean, there comes a point where we're only lying to ourselves, right? The rest of the world knows this stuff. I mean, the photographs is a great example. The argument against releasing those about 1,800 photographs, which are further pictures of Abu Ghraib and other interrogation sites in Iraq. We assume that they haven't been released because they're worse than the ones that we've seen. The government says to release them will be to imperil U.S. troops and personnel in the region because people will be so angry. It's like one of those arguments that proves how bad they are just by telling us that, right? If you see these things, you're just going to be homicidally angry at us, right? Well, who's in Iraq right now who could do American troops harm? ISIL. Who's in ISIL? Guys who were in those detention facilities, and they know those things, right? It's not a secret to them. The only people who don't know what's in those photographs is us. And it's been, the censorship, let's be very clear. The censorship regime that I've been talking about today was created for a very specific purpose, to allow torture to happen. That's why it was created. We created secret spaces because we knew this stuff was illegal and we couldn't do it in plain view. Mohammed keeps being hidden from the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's just consciously, deliberately aware that we're violating all of the international norms. But most of that stuff stopped happening in 2005 and 2006. The censorship that's happened from 2005 and 2006 to today is to protect people from prosecution. But more importantly, it's to protect us. We're protecting ourselves from having to confront the big questions that these things bring. So, just to close, topically, one of the most fascinating things that's happened in the United States right now, I'm going to thank Donald Trump for it. Okay? Donald Trump says, yeah, I'll waterboard, I'll do worse. Right? Who spoke up when he said that? The Pentagon and the CIA. The CIA said, no way. General Hayden, former head of the CIA, says, Donald Trump wants to waterboard, he better bring his own bucket because nobody at the CIA is going to do it. John Rizzo, the chief counsel of the CIA, the man to whom John Yoo and Jay Bybee addressed their sophistry about enhanced interrogation techniques, John Rizzo says there are about 250 CIA operatives still working at the CIA who were involved. We got their glimpses, right? These are the people who are going retching from the room and who are involved in those interrogations. And all 250 of those men and women will resign tomorrow if they're ordered to do these things again, right? So within the CIA, there's actually been some kind of soul-searching process. Who hasn't done it yet? Us, right? And that's where we are right now. We're long past keeping secrets from the rest of the world. We're long past keeping secrets from the agencies themselves, which know all these things, and in some ways have evaluated and corrected. The only people that don't know is us. And we have to stop that. We have to demand this information. We have to dig, and we have to dig, because we'll all be released by it. Right now, we have men and women who carry the burden of these things on their own, right? They deserve a chance to be recognized, forgiven, the way Mohammed has forgiven them. And we all deserve a chance to process these things so that we don't even, if the CIA won't torture people, then how the hell can Donald Trump stand up and say, let's torture people, right? We just have to close the loop on that conversation so we no longer have that kind of idiocy in our public discourse. So, and that's up to us. It really is.